Welcome to the Kate Dalley Show. The time is 2:06. Glad you're listening in today. We have a packed show today. Also, I've got Dave Dodderidge in the hot seat today.
I'm still here.
He's still here.
This is pretty hot.
And we've got a great guest. We've got Brandon Turbeville. Hi, Brandon.
Hey, Kate. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, absolutely. I'm just glad you can. We've been trying to get you back on the show for a long time, so this is really fun. So we have The End of Health Freedom, Real Conspiracies, 5-Cent Solutions, Dispatches from a Dissident, Volume 1, Volume 2, Road to Damascus. Man, you've written a lot. You've also published over 500 articles dealing on a pretty wide variety of subjects, including health, economics, government corruption, and civil liberties. You have a podcast called Truth on the Tracks that can be found every Monday night, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time at UCY TV. And it's great. I'm so glad you're here. Thank you, Brandon.
Yeah, thanks again.
Yeah, absolutely. So where do we start? To me, it just seems like this ginormous mess in the Middle East. And I think a lot of people are just confused by it. I've told Dave, we ought to do a show called Who's Our Enemy Today? Because it seems that our foreign policy seems to shift around quite a bit. And I'm not quite sure what's going on over there. We're not hearing a lot. I don't think we're hearing the right things, obviously, in mainstream media.
Yeah, and what's interesting is when I was on the show the last time, we were discussing the nature of these terrorists marching across the Middle East that now have the name ISIS, and I mentioned that they were entirely created by the Western governments, by the United States, by NATO, and of course the GCC and the Saudi Arabians and Israel. And we just had some documents released from the Defense Intelligence Agency, and this is very interesting because they were part of a larger collection of documents that were released as a result of a Judicial Watch lawsuit. And they were published by Judicial Watch on May 18th, and the original lawsuit had to do with some documents that they were trying to get released regarding the Benghazi incident, and they were unable to get the documents until they filed the lawsuit. So once the documents were released, again on May 18th, the mainstream elements of the media were covering the Benghazi aspect of the documents. This is what we heard during that week, right? We heard a lot of reports about the Benghazi incident. And while that's an important issue, I'm not going to downplay the importance of that issue, because it does tie in. What we do find is that there was about 7 pages of documents that were completely ignored by all of the traditional media outlets. And what these documents revealed was that the United States, Western countries, Turkey, the GCC, etc., knew that, essentially support ISIS, right? This is what these documents reveal, that the United States supports ISIS. And we could go through those documents, but essentially we're given the story that the so-called rebellion in Syria was an organic, grassroots, freedom-loving, democracy-loving protest, and we were told that early on.
Right.
I was following this early on. Other people were following this early on, and could tell you that this was not the case. Right? They were violent from the beginning. They were on the rooftops of buildings shooting children, women on their way to the market, men on their way to work, kids on their way to school. Always violent. They always had weapons. They were always armed. And the story we were told was that they were peace-loving, and that somehow Al-Qaeda just managed to jump in the middle of the protest and co-opt it, and then become a sizable force. Well, what these documents reveal is that that's not the case, and that Al-Qaeda was always a part of these so-called rebel organizations. The documents admit that Salafists, Muslim Brotherhood fighters, Al-Qaeda fighters were always the major part of the insurgency. And it says, without a doubt, that the West, that Gulf countries, and Turkey supported that opposition, again, of Al-Qaeda, Muslim Brotherhood, and Salafists. It also goes a little bit further to mention that, and this was 2012, that these so-called opposition forces were trying to control eastern areas of Syria, western areas of Iraq, and areas near the Turkish borders. It also mentioned that Western countries and the Gulf states and Turkey supported these efforts as well, and that they were looking toward creating a safe zone in Syria, much like what was created in Libya, where they declared a humanitarian corridor, essentially a buffer zone, and then they had a no-fly zone where they came in and they bombed the Libyan military and then murdered Gaddafi. The documents say that as the situation continues to unfold, there's the possibility of establishing what they call a declared or undeclared Salafist principality in eastern Syria. This is the area that they refer to as Hasaka or Deir el-Sur. This is the area, and again, with western Iraq. So they admit that there's the idea, that the plan of creating this undeclared Salafist or declared Salafist principality in eastern Syria and western Iraq, and say clearly that the United States and Western countries were supporting this idea, and that that's exactly what these Western countries wanted. Now, we have a declared Salafist principality in eastern Syria and western Iraq. It's called ISIS, right? So there's no doubt from looking at these documents that the United States, the GCC, NATO countries, and Turkey have clearly supported ISIS. It's admitted, right? This is part of the Defense Intelligence Agency and the Department of Defense.
Jeez. And that was 2012, and then we started seeing ISIS crop up in March of 2013 in the headlines.
Right. And
although they did give a break during Ebola. I just wanted to mention that for 4.5 months they didn't do anything while Ebola was in full effect. So
well, yeah,
I wanted to say that, yeah.
There was also the story that ISIS was going to infect themselves with Ebola and fly over to the United States.
Yes,
so.
I remember that. I remember those claims.
That was
anyway.
quite the strategic attempt. But
right.
There's, the name ISIS itself, people need to look at what this group is, because not to get too far afield, but the name ISIS, this is not a separate terrorist group. Again, the media will give you the story that you have Al-Qaeda, and then you have Al-Nusra, and then you have ISIS, and then you've got all these little tiny terrorist brigades and organizations.
That's what I thought. Yeah, I thought that it was a branch of Al-Qaeda.
Well,
Am I wrong?
It is Al-Qaeda, basically. What you have is, the point is that this was just a name change, right? You've got Al-Qaeda proper, which is the massive worldwide organization. And then in Iraq, you have Al-Qaeda in Iraq. In Syria, you have Al-Nusra Front, which is the Syrian branch of Al-Qaeda. And shortly around, I think it was around 2010 or so, the two groups, the Al-Qaeda in Iraq group, changed its name to the Islamic Emir of Iraq. They then changed their name once they went back to across the border to Syria, working with al-Nusra. They changed their name when they merged to the Islamic Emirate of Iraq and the Levant, right? So IEIL. They then changed the name again to Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, so ISIL. And then we have the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, so ISIS, and then they call them IS, right? Islamic State. So it's the same organization. There's just a number of steps of name changes here. So anytime you hear a mainstream media organization saying, well, Al-Qaeda and ISIS don't get along, that's just not true, because they're the same organization. And if the United States is saying, well, we're bombing ISIS, but al-Nusra has proven to be the biggest fighting force against Assad or against ISIS, it's quite frankly, it's a lie, because it's the same organization on the ground. It's just a few name changes. And all those little brigades, they're the same thing. They're just breakdowns and brigades. Each little brigade may have its own name, may have a specific makeup of terrorists, but it's the same overarching organization.
Were you surprised when Rand Paul came out a couple days ago and said it was the hawkish Republicans that put them in place? Because so many Republicans, I think heads exploded over that. And I wanted to say, well, yeah. I mean, the CIA, does the CIA create them then? Because I was under the impression the CIA actually creates or gives to them, right? But they had to be ordered to do that. And so were you surprised when Rand came out and said that?
To be honest, I don't know exactly what Rand, I don't really follow Rand, so I didn't know what he said. I know that there's this, of course, the one section that is extremely hawkish and warmongering, and then there's this other idea of blowback. I don't know what he was quite referring to, but I would say the idea of blowback, that essentially we created terrorists by our policies in the Middle East, illegal invasions and that sort of thing. While there is some, small truth to that, I think it's it's not going nearly far enough, because when you talk about blowback, then you're going to have to get into a race of what started what, who started the first, initiated the first violence. What I would say is you have to go back to the 1970s when we created Al-Qaeda, when Zbigniew
or even the 50s during the Cold War. I mean, it really sort of there was a minuscule start even then. I mean, it's been going on a long time, right?
Yeah, this is all part of sort of a Western, but it's particularly British, function of creating terrorist groups and creating what we would call a color revolution and that type of thing, as well as terrorism like Operation Gladio and that type of thing, where you have fighters coming in trying to overthrow the government and being used as proxy forces. But again, we have Zbigniew Brzezinski on video talking to the Mujahideen and telling them that this is a jihad, this is their holy war. And he admitted in an interview that they created Al-Qaeda not to push the Russians out of Afghanistan, but to pull them in. And that's a documented interview. He was the former national security director or security advisor for Jimmy Carter. So all of this goes directly back to that. And we've used Al-Qaeda on a number of occasions. We tried to assassinate Gaddafi, for instance, using Al-Qaeda. That came out of the British press when they had some British whistleblowers. So all of this is directly created by Western intelligence.
Mm-hmm. Why are we doing this?
Well, the goal...
From your study, supporting, aiding, creating ISIS, and training now in Turkey, I understand we're training new fighters up there. They're supposedly going to go against Assad, but we know they're going. Why are we doing this?
Well, the idea is that they want to overthrow and destroy the regime of Bashar al-Assad. The idea here is to destroy, and this was admitted in the documents, the defense intelligence documents as well. I should have mentioned that they pointed out there were two reasons why they wanted to fund these terrorist organizations, and one of them were to obviously destroy the Assad government. The other reason was to destroy what they defined as Shia expansion, referring to Shiite Islam. And this is basically the arc of influence held by Iran, right? So there's Iran, and then there's some elements of Iraq, particularly when Maliki was in power. And then you've got Syria and Hezbollah. And this, of course, is allied with Russia. And the idea is to break the Iranian influence in the Middle East, to weaken Iran's influence, and then to target Iran. And after Iran, the target will be Russia. So they're trying to weaken their way to Russia, weaken the Russian alliances to get to a direct confrontation with Russia. And that's very dangerous for everybody involved. But the idea here is that ISIS is being used in Syria, again, to destroy the government, to erase the Iranian influence, and also to put pressure on the Iraqi government, right? They don't want the Iraqis working with the Iranians, and they don't want the Iraqis to be fully independent of the United States, of this, the U.S. arc of influence, or sphere of influence, I guess we should say. So that's in short what the plan is.
What about all the ties that just came out in February between ISIS and Israeli Defense Forces? What was your take on that?
Yeah, that's been known about for some time, because the Israelis have been working with the U.S. and NATO, of course, in order to destroy Assad. Remember, we had a number of documents that were released that were connected to, neocon networks, like the Project for a New American Century, that called for the destruction of Syria, of Libya, Iraq, Iran, Hezbollah. It's quite prophetic, I guess you could say, right? We've got what countries have been targeted. Iran's the only one that hasn't been invaded, and they tried a color revolution there a few years ago. We've also got a number of other documents. The Brookings Institution has addressed this as well. They have a document called The Which Path to Persia. They've got a number of other documents as well where they call for the destruction of these same countries. General Wesley Clark, if you'll remember, said that he was in the Pentagon at one point, and he went in to visit a friend who had security clearance, and he was told that they were planning not to just invade Iraq, but also to invade Libya, Syria, and to destroy Hezbollah and then go on to Iran. This was all released, and this was in concert with the Israelis. The Israelis have a history of creating terrorist organizations themselves. I mean, we know, first of all, that not only are they supporting the terrorists in Syria, but they've been providing medical care to the terrorists who have come out of Syria and crossed the border into that the occupied Golan area and so forth. They provide them medical care and then send them back over into Syria. You can actually see a picture online with Benjamin Netanyahu in the hospital shaking hands with an Al-Qaeda fighter, right? Wow. You've also got this idea, I mean, even Hamas was largely created by Israeli intelligence. So they have quite the history of duplicity in creating terrorist organizations that can be used as proxy forces or can be used as a justification to get themselves involved in some type of military confrontation.
If you're just joining us, we're talking to Brandon Turbeville from Truth on the Tracks. You can catch his podcast every Sunday night, right, at 9 o'clock Eastern Time?
Monday nights.
Monday nights, 9 o'clock, and that's Eastern Time. And this is fascinating. I mean, do you feel like you go down the rabbit hole on this? I mean, there's just so many different countries and different relationships and everything else to take into account. Go ahead, Dave.
Let me ask a stupid question. Okay.
Good. I'm not the only one always, Come on.
I still want to know, why can't we just let it be? Why do we have to get in there and take over 7 countries? Why do we have to do all this fighting? Why are we trying to get the soft underbelly of Russia? Why don't we just... What's the goal?
Well,
is it worth it?
Well, no, it's not worth it. And I would say that, we don't have to do that, but unfortunately the people who are using the U.S. government and Western governments for this purpose are intent on what they refer to as world hegemony, right? I made the joke, this is world hegemony just means world domination, but it sounds more professional. And, this was written about by Zbigniew Brzezinski in his book, The Grand Chessboard, where he talks about world hegemony which is essentially a world government. If you follow this on to its natural realm, it's the idea of splitting Russia up into 3 parts so that it's not an individual powerful country. You have the concept of micro-states and mini-states by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who the idea is to destroy sovereign nations, break them up into little countries so they can't resist the will of the larger enforcing powers and larger corporations, banks, and that sort of thing. So just petty, quabbling little impotent states. So the idea here is indeed world hegemony and world domination by this international power and a standardized world system. That's essentially the goal.
So they want power.
Total power, yeah.
They want total power.
Interesting. All right.
And again, you can look in The Grand Chessboard by Zbigniew Brzezinski, and he spells all of this out. This is the architect of Al-Qaeda, right? And he's expanding on what the geopolitical goals are. And this is indeed a world system that is, sort of pounded into being by the Western powers like the United States and the European Union and so forth, NATO, by a series of military actions. But the idea is to break up sovereign countries into small little entities, but still maintain a world system, essentially.
So all these claims came out today. I think it was Alan West, and he was talking about ISIS is now drawing fighters from half the world's countries. How fast is ISIS growing, and what kind of threat do you think it is here in the United States? Because a lot of people want to know this. I mean, this is huge right now.
Well, yeah, ISIS has had fighters from all around the world for some time. I'm not sure if they've gotten one from each country in the world, but it's got to be pretty close. We've got them coming from the U.S., from places in Europe, from Australia, from Asia, everywhere. The question of how fast ISIS is growing, it's growing as fast as the Western powers will allow it to grow. We mentioned the idea that Turkey and the United States have agreed to train 15,000 more fighters, right? And a lot of people are questioning, is it really 15,000 or is it more than that? The last time they agreed publicly to train fighters, this was the group that turned up in the middle of the desert and started calling themselves ISIS, or at least the United States media started calling them ISIS. Remember, they trained tens of thousands of troops in Jordan and pushed them across the Turkish border into Syria, and that's how we've got the ISIS gain of these large swaths of territory in eastern Syria and western Iraq. That's how they got all that area in Raqqa and and so forth in Syria. So the question about how much of a threat they posed to the United States domestically, well, as a terrorist organization itself, by itself, I would say it's not a threat. But considering the fact that they're controlled by the Western intelligence agencies, then I would say they're a massive threat, because I would just say, bluntly, if any terrorist attack occurs on this soil under the name of ISIS, you don't need to look to the Middle East for the culprit. You need to look to Washington, D.C.
I think that too. Yeah, we've been talking about this.
How tight? Absolutely. How tight is our collar on them? Some people think that we've created a Frankenstein monster, and yes, we created them, but now they're starting to get out of control, and maybe is it tight enough that they're actually not independent individually? What do you think?
Yeah, it's tight enough that they are not going to do anything that they're not allowed to do. Now, at the bottom level, of course, if you get into an individual neighborhood in the middle of Syria, for instance, you're going to have death squad fighters who have a little more leeway to get off the reservation. We saw in Iraq a few of them got off the reservation and threatened some Western oil fields in Erbil, and they got bombed. But the vast majority of them are not going to get off the reservation. A lot of these guys are led by direct intelligence agents on the ground, whether it's CIA or French intelligence or Turkish intelligence. They've got a pretty tight collar on them.
Interesting. Yeah, because I always look at our government too.
And then you've got to figure, well, if the French and the British and whoever else is helping us with them, we've got to have some control over the French and the British. They got to be vassal states of ours. I mean, we're not working independently in all the Western states, are they?
No, I would say they're working in total concert with one another. I mean, I wouldn't really even view the U.S. and NATO as anything other than one part of one system, right? It's just these intelligence agents for one aspect, intelligence agencies, they're not bound by borders, or you don't just have the CIA here in the U.S. and the MI6 in Britain, for instance, and they work separately and then they occasionally talk to one another. This is all one big network, and they work in total concert with one another. Again, at the bottom levels, the guy who is in a cubicle 5 days a week is not going to be able to go over to MI6 headquarters and then have security clearance. But at the operative levels, these guys are part of one overarching organization. It's more like a cloud that kind of goes across borders and national borders, and they're all operating together.
The killing of Christians is actually, obviously grabbed the hearts of all Americans, and so you have a lot of people right now calling for boots on the ground and more effort and more of our guys over there. And I wanted to get your take on that, and also in general, there was a senior official, and I'm trying to remember his name, that came out and said, by midsummer will be full-blown war over there. We'll be involved in that. What's your take?
Well, if people are interested in defeating ISIS, then the first thing I would say is not to call for boots on the ground. It's to call for your government to stop funding them. If you want to stop ISIS, you tell Washington, D.C. to stop sending cash and arms and intelligence agents and American Air Force jets to give them air cover. That's what you do. You tell the same thing to the Turks, to the Jordanians, to the Saudis, and the GCC. We don't need boots on the ground. You want to stop ISIS? You can work with the governments who have been doing everything they can to destroy ISIS, which is Iraq, Syria, specifically the Assad government, and Iran. And you can work with Hezbollah because they want to see ISIS gone even more than most Americans do, because they have to live with them, and they're faced with it day in and day out.
So true. It's kind of like that truck that ended up over there, and ISIS is riding around on it, and it says something like, Bob's Plumbing on it from Texas.
Well, they're using all those Chevy trucks.
If you don't think this stuff's coming from here, I mean, my gosh, there you go. There's a perfect symbol of them driving around in a truck. And the guy's poor business in Texas was like, I don't even, how did it even get over there? I sold it, and all of a sudden it's over there, and they still left his logo and his number on it. And so if we don't think our stuff's going over there, then we're gravely mistaken, don't you think?
Yeah, and also this idea that when ISIS first appeared in the media, that it was just this massive military convoy across eastern Syria and then into western Iraq, and we just had no idea. Our intelligence agencies just had absolutely no idea how this could happen. Well, I guess they were too busy reading our emails over here to check the Iraqi media that was reporting that they were getting this onslaught of terrorist fighters. Just, complete coincidence. Once again, the most effective fighting force in the world is outsmarted by some, monkeys in a cave somewhere. So, this is.
I have a question. It's obvious that Turkey is doing a lot to support, to help us train and send people across the border into Syria and Iraq. But nevertheless, Turkey wants that oil pipeline from Russia. And it seems like they're at odds with one another. How much influence does Putin have maybe on turning the tide on this thing?
Well, that remains to be seen. It's actually kind of hard to tell because Putin is doing his best to get that pipeline through, and it looks like it's going to go through. And if you're talking about the one that's going to go through Turkey and then into Macedonia, from to Greece and Macedonia, that's why you're seeing a major color revolution taking place in Macedonia right now, by the way, is because Macedonia agreed to have that pipeline go through. So they couldn't stop it in Turkey or Greece. They're trying to stop it in Macedonia, the NATO powers, the U.S. powers. But it remains to be seen, really, and it looks like Putin is having more and more influence on the Turkish government if he can get this situation to play out. Now, how that will work in terms of the situation in Syria, I don't know, because Turkey has fallen for this NATO trap a few times, and they're a part of NATO, but they've been playing along quite well, and it doesn't show any signs of weakening the Turkish resolve to play right into the hands of, not into the hands, but play ball with ISIS and the U.S. powers. I mean, they just signed a deal with Qatar and Saudi Arabia that looks like they're going to be playing with the idea of a direct military invasion of Syria in the next few months. And there's also the talk. Well, they're also in talks with the U.S. and they just made an agreement to provide air cover to the terrorists, the new 15,000 terrorists that they're funding and being trained in I guess Jordan, I think, again, and then back in through Syria. So they're going to provide air cover. So this is essentially the buffer zone idea again. Is what we saw with Gaddafi, but it's taken a lot longer in Syria.
If you're just joining us, we're talking to Brandon Turbeville, and it's Truth on the Tracks. It's a podcast you can catch Monday nights at 9 p.m. Can you stay with us for a little while longer, Brandon? Sure. Okay, we're going to head off to a break. We'll be right back. Don't go anywhere. I know, it's riveting, isn't it? I'm thinking the same thing. We'll be right back.
Get out your maps.
All right, we've got Brandon Turbeville on the line. Hi, Brandon.
Hey.
Hi there. And Brandon has written, 6 books, so you can catch any one of them. Also, Road to Damascus, The Anglo-American Assault on Syria, The End of Health Freedom, Real Conspiracies. Also, Truth on the Tracks podcast. You can look that up and catch that on Monday nights, 9 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock our time. And Brandon, I wanted to ask you a little bit about Israel, but we have a caller, so we'll take the caller first, and then I want to know a little bit more about what's going on with Israel too. All right, hi caller, welcome to the show.
Hi, my question, I guess, is how is it that this cabal, it looks like the European, American, Israeli cabal, New World Order, running the show? How is it that they don't already control all of the countries? For instance, the Ayatollahs were trained in England and in Europe and then sent back to overthrow the Shah. And so it would seem to me that they already have their guys in Iran. And so I guess my question is, who is it that's left to even attack, and who are they fighting if they don't already control everybody?
Yeah, well, that's a good question.
Thanks for the question. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
I'm still getting an echo here. Okay.
Sorry, there we go. There we go.
Yeah. That's a good question, and I wouldn't say that they necessarily don't still have their people in power in most of these countries. The idea is, within a lot of these nations, the trend is toward more nationalism, whether they move forward with the times or with the system that's implemented, or whether they hang back and either try to hold on to personal power or try to cut a new path for themselves and their country, or whether they're just not ready to move forward. Any kind of resistance to any imperialist aims, any resistance to, for instance, an international banking system. If you also look at the countries that have nationalized central banks, not central banks private like the Federal Reserve, but the national banks that are owned by the government and operated by the government, you'll see that these are the very countries that are on the NATO target list as well. So you'll see any type of resistance to the world system that's trying to be implemented, whether it's geopolitical, whether it's financial, whether it's even some domestic policies. This is a threat to the system, and they will be taken out, or at least attempted to be taken out.
Yeah, and great answer. And also, Israel. Why hasn't ISIS invaded Israel? I mean, if they're this mad group running around all on their own, then why aren't they terrorizing everybody? And why are they being selective if we're not involved?
Yeah, no, it seems like 95% of the people they attack are other Muslims.
Yeah, they are, and the reason they're not attacking the Israelis is because they're not going to attack bite the hand that feeds them, essentially. Because again, I mentioned earlier that you can see pictures of Benjamin Netanyahu shaking hands with an Al-Qaeda fighter in an Israeli hospital. And we know that Israel has provided a series of airstrikes against Syrian military positions, whether it's bases or whether it's military operations taking place. They provided air cover for Al-Qaeda. And so the Al-Qaeda fighters, the ISIS fighters, are not going to go in and try to destroy Israel because they're not given orders to do that.
Makes sense?
Yeah, that does. Absolutely.
As far as the Iran and the Shah, yes, we did have the Shah there. When the Ayatollah Khomeini came over, there was a religious fervor, and it was sufficient to be able, at least from my perspective, to be able to overthrow our influence in there. And that fervor stayed there. The Ayatollah is basically the last word when it comes to decisions there. And these people, they're not under control of the West.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's regardless of what you think about them, and you're not, just because you oppose, for instance, foreign intervention in a particular country doesn't mean that you endorse the kind of religious-based rule that might be in place in that country. But the idea that any other country should get in and get involved, to me, is repugnant, and it's also. There's a fair bit of propaganda on the Iranians that should be ignored or at least investigated further in the mainstream media.
And we're talking with Brandon Turbeville, Truth on the Tracks podcast and numerous books. What is your feeling with Iran and our relationship with Iran, and why the sudden reversal on policy there to allow them, the capability for nukes?
Well, I think this is theater. I think this is nothing but theater. If you look at what happened with Iran has bent over backwards to work with the United States and to work with the Western powers here, because it was doing absolutely nothing wrong. It is a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Israel, for instance, is not. Iran does not have nuclear weapons, for instance. Israel does. And no one is trying to, have weapons inspectors come in or sanctions placed on Israel, for instance. The idea that Iran was trying to get a nuclear bomb, the U.S. intelligence agencies that investigated this, as well as the Israeli intelligence agencies that investigated this, corroborated over and over that Iran was not seeking a nuclear weapon. We even have documents and reports coming out of places like the Brookings Institution as well that have admitted this. We've had the National Intelligence Chief coming out and saying that they don't have, that they're not looking to get a nuclear weapon. We've also seen that their intelligence agencies have pointed out that the Iranians have a defensive posture in the Middle East. It's not offensive.
The head of the FBI came out and said, well, they are building them underground. What was your thought on that?
Yeah, well, he's supposed to be domestic focused, right?
Right.
FBI. So
yeah. Maybe
he should stick to worrying about domestic things. It's been repeatedly proven in terms of intelligence investigations with Iran that they are not seeking a nuclear weapon, and a nuclear capability, the capability to build a nuclear program is not the same thing as the attempt to do it, right? Lots of countries have the ability to produce a nuclear weapon. That means simply that you have technology available that if you decided to build a nuclear weapon, you could begin a program that would allow you to start working on building a nuclear weapon, and it would still take quite a while, right? You wouldn't just say, we want a nuclear weapon, and then snap your fingers and you have one. This wouldn't be an immediate thing to that end. For instance, Argentina and Brazil, they don't allow any extra inspections from the IAEA. A lot of other countries as well, they have nuclear capability. They have nuclear options, essentially, not the ability to, not the bomb, but they have the ability to build a bomb if they decide they want to. In other words, they have the nuclear capability, essentially.
Okay.
Right? This is what we're talking about. There's a big difference between capability and a program that is attempting to build a nuclear weapon. And Iran did not have a program that was attempting to build a nuclear weapon. They just had the ability to begin working on one. Okay? So there was nothing that they were doing that was in violation of anything, period. But yet they bent over backwards to make this nuclear deal, which actually is a sour, raw deal for Iran, right? It limits their the ability to enrich certain materials. It brings in more and more inspections, more than most countries would have to deal with. And the reason I think this deal was made, and again, it's a deal that I don't support. I don't think Iran should have ever had to make the deal to begin with. But I believe what we're seeing is a setup to where either this deal doesn't go through in June, because we still have the deadline of June 30th to iron out all the details. And you see that the French, for instance, and some of the Americans are claiming that if Iran doesn't have basically snap inspections anywhere, anytime, whenever the U.S. wants them, they have to have inspections go into military bases. You know, what country would allow that? And you've also, they're trying to demand that the Iranians set their nuclear scientists up for interviews, which means interrogations about nuclear secrets and that sort of thing. So the Iranians don't want to do that. The Western powers want them. So there's a possibility that the deal will fall through before June 30th, and there's also the possibility that it will be signed, and then at some point in the future, the Americans or the Israelis will come back and start whining that some type of small, minute, insignificant detail has been violated, and thus the deal has to be called off, and then there's sanctions, and then there's some type of military involvement. You know, the Israelis always have the option of bombing Iran, and if the Israelis bomb Iran, then the Americans will follow right in. The Israelis are always ready and willing to fight and die to the last American in any instance, and they know that many people will follow them right into any kind of line of fire. So it's unfortunate, but it's the way it is. So there's a report by the Brookings Institution, just to quickly get this out, is that they were saying that in an attempt to break the back of the Iranian regime, one of the methods that they could use was an Israeli strike on the Iranians, and that would bring the Americans in. So that's up there in the Brookings Institution reports.
How significant are those S-300s that they bought and are now manufacturing themselves, Iran?
Well, I wouldn't be too excited about it, but it also, you know, it is serious because they can use them, you know, to defend themselves and that sort of thing.
And we have a lot
I don't think Israel wants to lose too many jets.
Well, we have a lot of equipment and a lot of arms. Everything is being sort of unloaded. Dave was talking about before we came into studio today. What's your take on the next couple of steps? What do you think is going on and happening?
Well, you know, again, I think basically the idea here is to try to break Syria down first, and this is why we're seeing so much stuff happen right now, because we're coming up on that deadline for the Iranian nuclear deal. And, you know, again, this thought just popped in my head, and I want to get this out. That Brookings Institution document that I mentioned in reference to Iran, this document called Which Path to Persia, is all about how to get American military soldiers and American military involvement in Iran. And they mentioned that a U.S. strike against Iran should only take place after there's this widespread conviction that Iran has rejected a great, fair offer in terms of its nuclear program. And that's what we're seeing today. We're seeing this being paraded around in the mainstream media as if the United States has bent over backwards for Iran. It's actually quite the opposite. But you ask the average person about it, and you would think that we laid down and allowed Iran to get a nuclear weapon, and that's going to be the result of the result will be a nuclear war or something. So people should go read that document and see what's being planned. But the next few steps, I believe, we're seeing a greater push to get more terrorists into Syria via Turkey, again with the new terrorists, I guess we should say the new ones, being trained by the United States and Turkey. And we're seeing the terrorists now kind of preparing to march upon Latakia, which is a place that's seen fighting and it's seen massacres and atrocities by ISIS and Al-Qaeda before, but it's never been the victim of a major, massive assault, which is what we're seeing an attempt to do. So that's extremely unfortunate. The Syrian military seem to have hit a brick wall for a little while, but they have seemed to have hit a brick wall in the past and have managed to pull out some pretty big military victories. So I think what we're going to see is a greater push of proxy forces. And I think we're going to see an intensification of some of this stuff when in the next few weeks, because we're coming up on the June 30th deadline.
Interesting. Yeah.
The end of June is going to be very precarious for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's why, because I know I read that the Russians, they have ships lined up there in Tartus, and they're unloading all kinds of stuff for Syria.
That's what I was alluding to before.
Thermobaric bombs and intelligence and equipment, jamming equipment, all kinds of stuff. So I think that maybe Syria understands this and Russia understands this, and they're getting ready for that push.
It could be, and it could be also that the Syrians are trying not to do anything that would draw the Iranians in to help them with this nuclear deal coming up, this finalization of the nuclear deal, because if the Iranians get involved too heavily, then there's always the opportunity for the United States and the French to claim that they're acting aggressively in the Middle East, or there's the opportunity for a direct collision between the Americans and the Iranians. So that could be a reason as well.
Right. Thank you, Brandon Turbeville. I wish we had more time with you. Catch his podcast, Truth on the Tracks, 9 p.m. Eastern, 7 o'clock Mountain on Monday nights, and you can look that up online. Also, all of his books, Brandon Turbeville. It's been such a pleasure. Will you come back sooner than you did last time?
Absolutely.
Okay, excellent. Because I'd really love to have you back. I always like your take, and it's fascinating, all the research that you do. So thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Thanks for having me on.
All right, thanks,
you. Brandon.
And we'll be right back. Stay with us.
Truth on the Tracks you can catch every Monday night and Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on UCY.tv.